Welcome to Washington Watch with Congressman Walter Jones. Each month, we take a look at the events happening in Washington, D.C. and how they affect our lives here in eastern North Carolina. And now, here's your Congressman, Walter Jones.
Welcome to the June edition of Washington Watch. Today's guest is Congressman Gene Taylor. As my dear friend, was a friend of my father's as well. And Gene represents the 4th Congressional District in Mississippi. Before his election to Congress in 1989, Congressman Taylor served in the Bay St. Louis City Council, and in the Mississippi State Senate. He has had a hand-on experience in the United States Coast Guard, where he spent 13 years serving in the Coast Guard Reserve. Congressman Taylor serves on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the Armed Services Committee. On the Armed Services Committee, he is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Expeditionary Forces. And Congressman Taylor and his wife Margaret have 3 children, Sarah, Emily, and Gary. Gene, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for letting me be with you, and for all the nice folks in eastern North Carolina. It's been a while since I transited the intercoastal waterway there, but it was one of the highlights of my life. They were wonderful folks in a beautiful area.
That's very kind of you to share that, because I know at one time you told me you had some trouble with your sailboat and you had to dock in the district, and people were very kind and helped you find a part.
A guy threw me his truck keys and said, I don't have the parts and I don't have the time to fix it, but there's a hardware store down the road, and it was a diesel pickup truck, must have been worth $30,000. Didn't know me from Adam, and I'm going, these are really nice people. So for whoever that is back in North Carolina, thank you again.
Well, Gene, thank you, and I want to thank you for your friendship. You've been one of my best friends in Congress, and politics has never entered into our relationship, and I want to thank you for the help that you've given me on many issues. And today, because of your important position as the chairman, you have spoken out many times in the committee about your concern about our Navy, the shape of our Navy, where it is today, and where's it going to be tomorrow. Would you just kind of pick up on that point?
Well, Walter, you mentioned that I was lucky enough to serve with your dad and you. So I've been here for almost 20 years, and the fleet has shrunk under every president I've served with. I think we're finally bottoming out and starting to go in the right direction. As we know, next week the Sea Power Subcommittee will do several things. Number one, we're going to accept your recommendation for the changing of the title to the Secretary of the Navy and the Marine Corps. It's an excellent recommendation, and we sure hope the Senate will go along with us this year. Second thing that we're going to do is, since the Navy has failed to give Congress a shipbuilding plan, we're going to give the Navy a shipbuilding plan. We're going to tell them, based on what they have told us over the years, we're going to see to it that the next generation of carrier, which is going to have an electromagnetic launch, a series of timed electromagnets, they're going to shoot that plane off the deck, that they're going to have the proper oversight for that program, that it's going to be one person's career is going to be responsible for getting it developed, another person's career is going to be responsible for getting implemented on the ship that sails, and it's pass-fail. These guys are either going to get it done or they don't, and their promotions depend on that. We just haven't had that kind of accountability, so that we don't end up with a $7 billion helicopter carrier instead of a $7 billion aircraft carrier. We're also going to have advanced funding for the follow-on vessels for the Ohio-class submarines. Great submarines, but they're getting up in age, and it's time to come up with a newer, better. We're going to have language that says the littoral combat ship will be delivered on time and on budget, or we're going to find a new contractor. It's pretty simple stuff. That's what business people do. We're going to have language that says the DDG-51 destroyer, the world's greatest destroyer. For a while, the Navy thought they wanted to do away with them, but based on some ballistic missile threats coming from potential enemies around the world, we now know that that's the best ship to respond to it. So we're going to give the Navy multi-year procurement authority so they can get the best price for the ships that we know we want to use for the next 40 years. We're going to get with your help, we passed language that says our next generation of cruisers will be nuclear powered, so that we don't have to call up Hugo Chavez or the Ayatollah for a refill. And so we're going to put advanced money in this year and tell the Navy, get going. By the time you build this, our existing Aegis cruisers are going to be up in age, so let's get going right now and get these things into production. So those are, we're giving them a shipbuilding plan starting with the smallest platform, which is the LCS, all the way up to the carrier. And lastly, there's been some contention over the years. About 20 years ago, in the wake of the Princeton and another naval ship hitting mines in the Middle East, the Navy started a crash program to build some coastal mine hunters. Some of them were built near you in Georgia. Some of them were built in my congressional district. But they put a foreign engine in, and the engine from day one was a dog. The Navy now, these ships are only about 15 years old, on a fiberglass hull that's going to last indefinitely. The Navy wants to retire them. And I'm thinking, and they're saying, well, our allies can provide that service for us. Our allies can do coastal mine hunting. I'm like, no, you never know when the allies are going to show up, but more importantly, you don't when they're not going to show up. We need to have that capability in the United States Navy, so we're going to propose the money to put new American-built engines in those ships, keep them around for another 30 years just in case it happens, because, again, the things like mines, things like improvised explosive device, those are the poor man's smart bombs. And we know that our enemies have used them in the past, and we don't want our enemies to have that capability to cripple the American fleet anywhere around the world. So something else we're working on, because marine aviation is so important to all of America, but particularly your area, we're going to recommend the continuation of multi-year procurement of F-18 E&Fs. The F-22 is a great plane, but it's an expensive plane. It's about $160 million a piece, maybe as much as $200 million a piece. The Joint Strike Fighter, probably $200 million a piece when they come along. F-18s, we've been paying about $88 million a piece, but the manufacturer, realizing that this could be the end, has come back to us and said, you know what, if you let us build some more, we'll build them for $50 million a piece. That's a huge price reduction on a plane that is the best in the world. In fact, our committee had a hearing the other day. We had 2 Navy Admiral aviators, a Marine Corps General aviator, and I said, okay, you're in an F-18, what plane in the whole world troubles you? What plane can't you shoot down? And they said an F-22. Well, that's on our team also.
Right.
And the other thing, so we want a good mix of F-22s and F-18s, the idea being if we ever have an unintended consequence of engine failures, or like when we had the longeron problems on the F-15 where they literally were breaking apart. We don't want all our eggs in one basket, but we know that F-18 is a phenomenal program. It's an affordable program. It's the world's best fighter produced in numbers. And we know that the Marine Corps and the Navy needs them. So we feel like, again, with the great help of guys like you and the other members of the Armed Services Committee, we're taking the steps to defend our nation.
Gene, thank you for that summary. I mean, that's really what I know the people back home in my district, with Camp Lejeune, Cherry Point, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, are very, very interested in how we're going to maintain a strong military. That brings me to a point that it is related. You are a member of the Blue Dogs on the Democratic side. Would you share with those who might be watching this show, because I want to tie that into the debt of this nation?
Well, the Blue Dogs were formed shortly after the Republicans took over Congress in 1995. And it was the most conservative of the Democrats who felt like our party had let us down on things like a balanced budget, on other social programs. And that if we ever wanted to get the majority back, we needed to change the tone of the Democratic Party. And I think to a large extent we succeeded in getting the majority back. I feel, unfortunately, the Blue Dogs and some other members, and not every Blue Dog, but by and large, much like the Republicans lost their zeal for a balanced budget, I'm seeing way too many Democrats who've lost their zeal for a balanced budget. And although I would remind folks that George Bush did inherit an annual operating surplus with about $5.4 trillion worth of debt, he quickly turned that into annual operating deficits and accumulated another $5 trillion worth of debt.
And that's why we're the minority and you're the majority.
Right. So, and again, so both parties have made the same stupid mistake. Both parties have straddled our kids and our grandkids with debts that are just unforgivable. And one thing that you and I are aware of, because it's our job, is the declining ratio of workers to retirees. That we're getting fewer and fewer workers, more and more retirees. So it doesn't get easier in the future to pay our bills. It only gets harder because there'll be fewer people in the workforce. When your dad and my dad were in their 20s, there were about 20 working people for every retiree. Right now it's only 3 people for every retiree, 3 working people, and by the time, if we're lucky enough to live to retirement age, it'll be only 2 working people. So we got to pay these bills now. This idea that somehow it gets easier in the future, that medical is going to be somehow cheaper in the future, that weapons are going to be cheaper in the future, forget it. That's not going to happen. All we do know is that there'll be fewer people to pay these bills, and so one of the things that I hope in the very near future that the Blue Dogs will get back to their intended purpose, which was to balance the budget. I would hope my Republican colleagues, and I know you're there, would get back. And one of the things you don't hear anymore is balanced budget. You don't hear it from the talking heads on the radio. And we have to do it because we have to have a system that no matter who's in the majority,
that's right,
no matter who's in the White House, that the rules are you can't spend more than you collect in taxes. And we both know that if something's worth doing, it's worth paying for right now.
Gene, that is so well said by you because the whole thing is what I'm concerned about the military is the dollars. Even though, I mean, your leadership and others on the committee, ranking members too, have taken some great steps at trying to make the purchasing power more efficient, if I can say it that way.
I think that's right.
But the one thing that has bothered me, we are, as you well know and you just articulated, we are what's called a debtor nation. We owe the Chinese $800 billion. And you know better than I, because of your position, that the Chinese are tripling their expenditure on their military.
Right.
And it's not that I or many people in my district feel like the Chinese are going to attack America, but they are building a military that if we continue to make these commitments around the world and wear out our Marines and our Army and our Navy and our Air Force, that we're going to be so far behind the eight ball that it would take years and years to accomplish what you were just saying.
Well, the Chinese, if we don't turn our shipbuilding plan around, and we're going to turn it around this year, but if we don't, the Chinese were on schedule for around 2018 to have a fleet as large as ours. Now, I still think our fleet's going to be a heck of a lot more capable.
Right.
We're going to have carriers. They might have one by then. We're going to have 11. We're going to have more sophisticated warships, but there is value in numbers as well, particularly if they're looking at, if God forbid there should be a conflict with them, they're going to be able to play on their home court. We're going to be, using that analogy, we're going to be we're going to be thousands of miles away from ours. And so we're taking some of those steps. One of the reasons for the nuclear cruiser is that it just doesn't make much sense to have a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that can go for 30 years without refueling for the ship. We realize we have to get fuel for the planes. If the ships that protect that carrier have to be refueled every 3 to 5 days. With a nuclear-powered cruiser, you now have a ship that can go for 30 years for propulsion purposes on the carrier that doesn't have to be refueled, and the ship that's protecting it goes for 30 years, just like our submarines. So, again, we're taking some of the proper steps, but going back to what you said, and I say this at my town meetings all the time, with the loss of the American industrial base, with the huge deficits we're running, we do not need to be in a position where we're borrowing money from the Chinese to buy weapons from the Chinese to potentially defend ourselves from the Chinese. That is a horrible scenario.
It is actually, and you have said it so well, but I agree totally, it is not what the Constitution intended for this country to be in this kind of situation. You and I have worked together on PTSD, soldiers and Marines, and airmen too, and that are coming back with...
Well, you're too modest. I signed on to your idea on post-traumatic stress, and you are exactly right in taking the right steps. And Walter, for those of you who didn't see it on C-SPAN, did a phenomenal job of getting several panels that came before the Armed Services Committee to recognize the severity of the problem, to take a look at some of the solutions he's proposed. He's got legislation to follow up on that, and quite honestly, to get a general or admiral to break away from his prepared testimony and agree with you straight across the board, it was pretty remarkable. But they knew that you were right on that issue, and for the families of loved ones who in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere in the world that's dangerous where they're serving our country, it's great to know that guys like Walter are not only looking out for the equipment they need in wartime, but looking out for those things they're going to need when they come home.
Well, you're very kind and generous with that comment. Gene, I'm like you, and I'd say every member of Congress, we appreciate our men and women in uniform and their families, and we know we've called on them to carry a heavy load for this country, and we will be there for those in uniform, as you have been for 20 years now.
And let me brag on Walter again. When I had the good fortune to become the chairman of the Sea Power Subcommittee, we got oversight for the Marine Corps, and almost almost every Mississippian that I know of who has died in Iraq died from an underbody explosion to a Humvee.
Right.
Great vehicle. We up-armored them, made them a little bit better. We put some weapons on them, made them better, put jammers on them to keep the improvised explosive devices, made them even better. But what I missed, and what a lot of people missed, was that it had a vulnerability from an underbody explosion. I'm not saying anything our enemies don't know, they know it. It got even worse because that tunnel where the drive shaft goes tended to shape the charge, which is why it had such catastrophic effects. It actually forced all the blow in the vehicle. A great retired Army colonel by the name of Jim Liddick stops by my office one day, shows me this photograph. Hey, the South Africans went to a V-shaped bottom 20 years ago. South Africans decided that you got to get the fuel tanks to blow away, that if you get it higher off the ground, that force of the explosion is reduced by the cube of the distance, so you get it up off the ground. And so long and short, with the help of Walter and a lot of other people, we started a crash program to build 15,000 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. We're now in the process of building about another 5,000, a smaller but more nimble version for the Marines in Afghanistan. And so we are recognizing that we did not have everything in the inventory we should have had. I also want to compliment Secretary Gates. I think, quite honestly, if we tried to make this change with Secretary Rumsfeld, because it wasn't his idea, therefore it wasn't a good idea.
You're exactly right, Gene.
Secretary
exactly
Gates is credit. Well, and Walter was on the subcommittee then. We had a hearing. We said we identified it. We said we're going to build 15,000 of these. And to his credit, the very next day he said, no, you're not going to build 15,000. We're going to build 17,000. He put Marine Corps General, Brigadier General Brogan in charge of that program, and he has done a wonderful job of taking it from concept to delivering literally shiploads of them within less than 1 year. And so he's doing a great job, and we're going to get that smaller, nimbler, better vehicle for Afghanistan for the Marines that are going over.
Well, Gene, I again want to compliment you, and you're right. We've got a great committee. Partisan politics is set aside. We do what's right, working together for the good of the military, and so many of the issues that have improved the equipment. You have been responsible. Duncan Hunter, who's not in the Congress now, he's retired, and others on your side, Neil Abercrombie, we can name them all. But all in all, I think you giving that story was excellent for this reason. I want the people back home to see leaders like you on this show, and I want them to listen carefully to the information you've shared with them today, because it shows that we care about our men and women in uniform.
We're grateful for them.
And I know that you and I have been to Walter Reed. We only got a couple minutes left, but I know you and I have been to Walter Reed many times, and I've seen the pain in your face. Right. You've seen the pain in my face as we've talked to those who have been severely wounded. And I want to thank you for the many times we've been over there together, not so much recently because we've been so busy here on the Hill, but you and I have been there 2 or 3 times when we've talked to the parents, and you're a man of compassion, you're a man who cares, and I do too. So.
Well, no, Walter, you've taken the lead on so many things that the fact that you've taken the time to individually write every family that lost a loved one is just unbelievable. But great asset to the Congress, a great friend, and again, for all the folks in coastal North Carolina, a beautiful area, and I hope to make it back there soon.
Well, I hope that you will be able to go down the intercoastal waterway. We're working to get more money to do some dredging there, not just for Gene Taylor, but for the other boaters that will be going north and south. And Gene, with this, I think we got about a minute left. I want to thank you. I've told people many times that the first time I met Gene Taylor, he came down to my father's funeral in 1993, I believe it was, or 92 now, 92. And that's the first time I met Gene Taylor. And those of you watching the show can still see he's a young man, so he had to be real young when he came to Congress. Again, he's been one of my best friends.
And to this day, I have the quote that one of the preachers read at Walter's dad's funeral attached to my desk.
Right. And that was a sad day, but I know my father was pleased to see his friends come down from Congress to say goodbye to him, and I want to thank you for being there.
No, thank you, Walter.
I want to thank Gene Taylor for being. This has been one of the best shows we've done in 15 years. It's a lot of information for those of you in eastern North Carolina that Congressman Taylor, Chairman Taylor shared with you. in about just about a minute, we're going to have Glenn Downs, my Chief of Staff, to come back on the show, and we'll talk about some issues facing the district. But Gene, thank you so much for being on this show, and God bless you, and may God bless America. Thank you. Be right back with you. Welcome to the second edition of the June Washington Watch. I was very pleased to have Gene Taylor on the show, and I hope you enjoy that portion of it. Now for about 5 or 6 minutes, I have Glenn Downs, my Chief of Staff, and to talk about some issues that maybe you're getting calls on, or letters or emails nowadays. But
Congressman, you get all the above from the people of the 3rd District. They are not shy about expressing their opinion. And one of the things that really seems to be on people's minds, in addition to some of the national security issues you and Congressman Taylor talked about, is this whole state of the economy. And in a larger sense, as it relates to the whole worldwide problem. And as we're taping here today, Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner has been over in China, and you and Congressman Taylor talked about China. So what do you think that's all about?
Well, it was kind of interesting, Glenn. I'm glad that you mentioned this, because I think we talked about it a day or two ago, that Secretary Geithner spoke to some Chinese students at Peking University, I think it's called, and when he talked about the sovereignty of America, they laughed at him. And that's embarrassing to me as an American citizen, that any of my officials, no matter whom they might be, would be laughed at. But the Chinese know that we're borrowing money from them. They know they're buying our dollar bills as an investment. They're buying other financial instruments. And many of us here in Congress, in both parties, and you did make reference to Congressman Taylor as well, we're very concerned that the Chinese could just almost say, we're through buying your debt, Uncle Sam. And then where's Uncle Sam going to go to sell his debt?
Well, at this point, because the American industrial base has eroded so much, and you and Mr. Taylor talked about that as it relates to defense industries, but how concerned are you about the rise, in addition to the rise of the U.S. owing money to China, about the rise of their industrial base and the decline of ours, and what does that mean for jobs and people in eastern North Carolina?
Glenn, I am of the firm belief that this new administration, and I'd be saying the same thing if John McCain had won, we need to take time, and we need to start today to try to rebuild our manufacturing base. It will never be what it was 20, 25 years ago, but as you just made your point, and Mr. Taylor before you, we don't have a manufacturing base. We are what's called a service nation. And somehow, with the right leadership in Washington, both parties, we need to start trying to figure out how we can reestablish our manufacturing base for this country. Well, I don't know what the future holds for our children.
One of the general sentiments that gets, or it's almost a question that gets asked when people do call in, is how did this happen? I mean, what sorts of policies? Were they trade policies? Were they domestic? How did it come to be that America lost its manufacturing base to a place like China?
Well, I think greed. I think that corporations and companies here in America decided that they could move jobs overseas, pay them less money, less wages. And to me, we're supposed to be a nation, a Judeo-Christian nation, and as far as I'm concerned, we need to do what we can to bring those jobs back. Not all will be possible to bring back to this country, but many can be brought back. And that's going to be a little give and take from the union side of it, to also the management side of it. And it can be done.
Well,
it can be done.
Right now, Congress is considering, it's slow motion a little bit right now, but considering another so-called free trade agreement, a Panama free trade agreement. And Mr. Obama's trade ambassador, the U.S. trade representative, is talking about pushing even more of these trade agreements. Is that, to what extent is that, you talked about greed, but what extent do those policies affect?
Well, the policies both from the Bush administration and now the Obama administration, I think there needs to be a moratorium on any trade agreement. I think for the next 2 to 3 years that Mr. Obama would do this country a big favor if he say for the next 3 years, no new trade agreements. But I know that probably won't happen, but we might talk about some legislation that we might put in. But Glenn, we've got 23 seconds. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but thank you for being on the show. And I want to thank those of you that are watching these shows. We enjoy doing this for you, the people of the 3rd District. I think this one today, like many, have been very informative, and I want to thank you for watching it. In closing, I would like to again say, let's remember our men and women in uniform overseas. God, please continue to bless our men and women in uniform, and God, please continue to bless America. Thank you for watching the show.
Thank you for taking the time to join us for Washington Watch.